Hi class, today we're here to talk about chapter 5, which is related to motor, sensory, and perceptual development. So let's go ahead and get started. Your book actually begins this chapter by talking about something called the dynamic systems theory. Now, this was proposed by a researcher by the name of Dr. Esther Thalen. And in this theory, she sort of thinks about how infants are interacting with the world around them. And this is pretty interesting because part of this theory is that there is something in our environment that motivates us to want to engage in a behavior. And I want to actually show you just something here very quickly, a video kind of outlining what we could think about with this dynamic systems theory. So here I want you to pay particular attention to our child, right? Our child has a balloon attached to his foot and is then kicking the foot to make the balloon move. And this fits right in line with kind of what we were talking about with the dynamic systems theory, right? Because here our infant, has to realize that they could move their leg. They then realize that by moving their leg, it is moving the balloon. They are motivated to move that balloon, and so they're going to continue kicking. So let's go ahead and take a look at that video quickly. So this isn't a plug for this brand. It was just a nice video that I could show you illustrating this dynamic systems theory. And so here, one of the ideas is that we could actually get children to move and engage in behaviors because they're motivated to want to do so, right? And this could be a fun way to kind of help build some of that motor skills in your child. When we are born with reflexes. These are unlearned automatic responses to stimuli. This can be things like blinking our eyes or breathing. But we also have some reflexes that we are born with and then sort of fall away as we get older. And then there are some reflexes that we keep throughout our entire lives. So some things like breathing, eye blinking, sucking, swallowing, these are all survival reflexes. These are going to be inborn responses that allow us to adapt to our environment. We need them, right? Without them, we would have some real serious problems. Interestingly, though, we're also born with primitive reflexes. These are going to be reflexes that are controlled by the subcortical area of the brain, and they actually tend to disappear over the course of the first year of our life. They're not clearly useful. There are some researchers that sort of believe that they are just existent or remnant of evolutionary history. That we don't really need them. They're not really useful anymore, but they just still sort of exist. Most of these will actually disappear within the first few months of life. In fact, if you have a child, they'll perform some of these reflexes. They'll kind of take a look. Your pediatrician will kind of take a look at this. And then after a while, they'll check just to make sure they don't exist anymore. If you were to find some of these reflexes into later life, it could be indicative of some sort of neurological problem. So I have a couple of videos showing you a few of these different reflexes, but just kind of talking about them in your book. We have the palmar grasp. If you give a baby your finger, the child will immediately sort of grab onto this. And this is still visible 5 or 6 months. If this is still visible 5 or 6 months after, a child is born, we're kind of getting into that territory where it could indicate some sort of neurological problem. The Moreau reflex is kind of the startle response. I'm going to show you this when a baby is sort of tipped back and startled, they will immediately kind of throw their arms out and sort of arch their back. The swimming reflex, if an infant is placed face down in a pool or water, they'll actually begin to paddle and kick in some sort of swimming motion. But this reflex actually disappears between 4 and 6 months. So let's say you put your 8-month-old baby in water, assuming that they'll be able to do this, they will not be able to. At that point, you would need swim lessons or something like that, right, to help a child understand how to interact and be safe in the water. The stepping reflex, here this is present at birth, and we actually can see that infants have this sort of rudimentary ability to kind of step, just like, and this is on kind of flat surfaces. It almost looks like the child's walking if we hold up their body weight. But just like with some of the other things that we've sort of talked about, this will disappear. In fact, it actually disappears sooner. About 6 weeks after a child's born, you actually won't see this anymore. If you stick a child and have them sort of be upright, you won't see this at all. If you put like a 3-month-old, the child will not step. This will then sort of reappear later on when a child is beginning to walk. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these different reflexes. So here is our Babinski reflex. I apologize, some of these videos kind of have sort of weird music accompanying them. But with our Babinski reflex, you're going to see the child toe. You kind of run your finger on the back of their foot. They're going to arch out all of those toes. So let's just go ahead and take a look at this.
Testing the Babinski reflex in infants. The Babinski reflex can be tested in infants by firmly stroking the sole of the foot with a finger or a blunt object along the lateral side from the heel to the toes. Typically in infants, a tonic dorsiflexion of the big toe as well as a plantar flexion and spreading of the small toes occur together. This is known as the Babinski sign.
Okay, now we've got our Moreau reflex. Remember, this is sort of that startle reflex. So you can see this again here. Our baby's kind of fanning, kind of see that kind of startle response, right? The baby's hand is kind of moving out. And then this is our stepping or walking reflex. Again, remember, this is only going to be evident kind of the first few weeks of life. You get into our 3rd month, you're not going to see this anymore. Actually, even into the second half of the 2nd month, you're not going to see this anymore. This one's really actually quite fascinating. There was a research study where they actually took children and put them into water, and you actually saw this stepping reflex. The sort of conclusion that the authors came to, the researchers came to, was that the top part of our body weight becomes so heavy that we're not able to hold it up. Even if somebody is helping us, like even the leg muscles, all that becomes heavier. It becomes much more difficult to engage in that stepping behavior. When you stick a child into water, then it removes that gravity, right? And so it allows for that reflex to happen because these muscles aren't being kind of challenged in the same way. Okay, So this is a general list of some of the different reflexes. We've talked about a few of them. The sucking reflexes, that makes a lot of sense to us. This would be if we kind of touch a child's cheek, that's the rooting reflex. With our sucking reflex, the child, you stick a bottle, a nipple, something in their mouth, automatically they'll kind of start sucking on that object, put a pacifier in there. The rooting reflex, if you are to take a finger, the child will actually reorient themselves towards that and then actually begin that sucking. So you might see the sucking and the rooting reflex together. This is to help orient the child towards a food source, right? A nipple or a bottle. Both of these things would kind of, you would see the child sort of orienting towards that. So kind of thinking about our development and how some of these, we see some of these changes in our physical development, we're going to see the kind of our gross motor skills becoming better. They're going to be, easier to control our muscles. And our gross motor skills are going to be skills that involve a large sort of muscle activity. In infancy, primarily, we're going to see this manifest as learning to walk. In childhood, we kind of have this improvement in our motor skills. Now kids are going to be able to run and jump and climb. They might be able to learn some sort of sports skills, right? So they'll be able to kick a ball and make that contact between their foot and the ball, and then follow that with their eyes, and then run and then kick the ball again, right? In adolescence, we're seeing further improvement. In adulthood, we actually see a lot of peak performance happening in late adolescence into the beginning of emerging adulthood. Our peak performance is actually very typically sometime in late adolescence and emerging adulthood, and then we start to see a decline later. But after we get to about 30, we're going to see a pretty big decline in terms of our motors, not a big decline, but we'll start to begin the decline in our motor skills. This kind of shows you a visual of some of the big gross motor skill developmental milestones that we're seeing between the ages of 0 to 15 months. And what I want to kind of orient you to here is you kind of see that there's a range. So you might get a kid that is sitting without support, right? And then you've got another kid that still hasn't, kind of able to get up with some support, right? And parent over here is seeing kid over here and being like, oh my gosh, this kid's so advanced. But remember, everything occurs in this range. And so even something like this, standing with support, this is huge, 5 months to 10 months, right? Or walking using furniture. We call this cruising, kind of moving around using furniture. We've got 7 months all the way to 13 months. That's a pretty big range. And a lot of times you'll hear parents that say, oh, my kid was walking, by X months, and they're super advanced for their age. They're very, very intelligent. Now, that child may very well be intelligent. However, how quickly that child starts walking is probably not an indication of that. It's sort of separate. Okay, so just sort of keep that in mind. Oftentimes parents really start seeing this stuff and they get really bogged down by it. I completely understand. I know this, and I would still see my son and say, man, he's not walking yet, right? Like, I wish he was kind of at the front end of that range. And he did it, right? I mean, maybe it was a few weeks later than what I was hoping, but it was okay. Like, he still did it, right? And so he still falls definitely within that range. As we get into late adulthood, we start to see decreased activity levels, and this could be kind of related to both biological and psychological health. We know that naturally aging does lead to kind of gradual deterioration. However, just the ways that we are interacting with our environment are really important. So what does our lifestyle look like? What types of healthy eating patterns, right? So remember, we talked about kind of health in chapter 4. This is a continuation of that. If we make really good and healthy choices, how does that influence our decline in our gross motor skills? This is a graphical representation kind of looking at the difference between young adults and older adults in terms of difficulty and difficulty in movement, and also how long it takes to engage in that movement, right? So here you're very clearly seeing that it takes older adults much longer to have that same movement as compared to somebody who's younger. Now, the more difficult the movement in general, it takes everyone across the board more time, but you see a stark difference between our older adults and our younger adults. All right, so kind of as a review, those gross motor skills are related to those large muscles. Our fine motor skills then are related to kind of fine-tuning movements. These are things related to kind of like finger dexterity, right? So kind of grabbing and pulling and writing. In infancy, this is related to things like reaching and grasping. In early childhood, it'll be picking up kind of small objects, building things. We move into childhood and adolescence. Now we're talking about writing, and you might see that improvement in your writing if you've ever seen some work that you did, if your parents ever saved any artwork from when you were a child, and you look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I used to write that way. By 10 to 12, children can do crafts, they can play musical instruments, right? Because now they're getting that movement. They have those more control over those fine motor skills. In adulthood, we're going to kind of see something similar to those gross motor skills. The speed may decline in middle and late adulthood. However, we are able to kind of compensate for some of these things. And your book kind of talks about this in a little bit greater detail. So our skills kind of may decline in middle and late adulthood with those fine motor skills. Again, health becomes really important as well. But then there are some things that we're still really good at, right? So we're still really good, and we're still competent at being able to write even as we get older. Now, if you've got some kind of shaking or things like that, that might affect what that looks like, right? But in terms of our ability, we still retain that into older adulthood. So kind of, across the board, when we're looking at older adult development, we do have sort of a slowing in our movements. There can be a lot of reasons for this. It could be related to kind of the stimuli that we're taking in, the interference of that. Now, we engage in compensation, so sometimes we may not really see some of the deficits, when we are first experiencing them. They might kind of happen later. It's important to also note that we are capable of learning new motor tasks throughout the lifespan. But as we, get older, we might be a little bit slower at doing so, as, kind of engaging in that behavior as compared to a younger adult. All right, so this kind of gives us a good understanding of those motor skills. Your book also goes on to talk about sensation and perception and the difference between these. It's also a good idea here in this chapter to note some of the differences that we're going to see in that sensation and perception as we age. There's also in your book kind of talking about vision and eyesight and how that changes over the course of the lifespan, hearing as well. So be sure to take a look at all of those points in your chapter as well. All right, well, that leaves us then for at least the first part of our notes here. And if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to schedule some office hours with you. All right, you have a great day and a wonderful rest of your week. Bye-bye.